let's get a little further in.
Een aanwijzing voor een onderzoeksprogramma dan als een aanwijzing voor het feit dat de mens uit zichzelf zo verschrikkelijk veel klaar zou kunnen spelen. Voor hem is dat begrip menselijke natuur eigenlijk een soort van wetenschappelijk boodschappenlijstje en niet meer dan dat. En Chomsky wil dit wel accepteren als maar duidelijk is dat vakken als biologie, fysiologie en neurologie voorlopig nog helemaal niet over de middelen beschikken om die menselijke natuur en dat taalvermogen adequaat te kunnen beschrijven. Vrij vroeg is het debat zo aangeland op een punt waar het gespreksleider elders de grootste moeite zal kosten om de partners met elkaar in contact te houden. Voor een deel ligt het natuurlijk aan de taal die ze spreken, maar voor een veel groter deel ligt dat aan het feit dat Chomsky en Foucault ieder in een verschillende denkwereld zitten. Zodat men begrippen heel gemakkelijk langs elkaar heen glijden. We krijgen eigenlijk het merkwaardige schouwspel te zien van twee breinen die gelijktijdig aan het denken zijn, om de beurt een begrip oppikken uit het betoog van de ander, om dit begrip dan vervolgens te belichten vanuit hun eigen denksysteem. Daarbij speelt dus voor Chomsky een grote rol dat begrip creativiteit, waarover nu een heel groot stuk van het debat zal gaan. Voor Chomsky is creativiteit eigenlijk een kenmerk van alle mensen. Iedereen werkt ermee. De verkeersdeelnemer, die ter plaatse in een onverwachte situatie moet gaan bedenken wat hij zal doen. De opvoeder, die niet terug wil vallen op autoritaire gedragspatronen en tegenover een lastige pupil zelf nieuw gedrag moet uitvinden. Maar vooral geldt deze creativiteit voor het kind dat een taal leert en dat daarbij merkwaardigerwijze leert om zelf nieuwe taal te produceren, te maken. Foucault staat daar tegenover. Hij vraagt voortdurend de aandacht voor het zogenoemde epistemologische veld waarbinnen de menselijke activiteit plaatsvindt. Dit epistemologische veld, oftewel episteme, wordt in het profiel omschreven als het geheel van niet bewuste regels die de algehele organisatie van onderling gescheiden velden van kennis beheersen. Foucault spreekt ook over tableau. Hij noemt het ook systeem van elementen. En in het debat valt ook het woord grille, tralie of rooster. We kunnen misschien het best spreken van een netwerk waarbinnen iedereen in een bepaalde cultuur denkt of hij wil of niet. Het zijn eigenlijk regels waaraan het denken van iedereen gehoorzaamt en met behulp waarvan iedereen zoekt naar bepaalde identiteiten, samenhangen enzovoort. En dit netwerk nu is niet de uitvinding van bepaalde individuen. Het bepaalt veel eer de regels van de denken- en doegewoonten, van het denken- en doespel dat we cultuur noemen en waaraan ieder individu eigenlijk onderhorig is. Een dergelijk netwerk is ook geen ding of idee, maar het ligt precies tussen ding en idee in. En de geschiedenis van het denken is dan voor Foucault ook niet de geschiedenis van ideeën, of zelfs zoiets als de ontwikkeling van de geest of iets dergelijks, maar veel eer de afwisseling van discontinue transformaties, van discontinue overgangen van het ene netwerk naar het andere. Dat is dus een heel andere aanzet dan die van Chomsky, bij wie die creativiteit in het centrum staat. En het is duidelijk dat we op dit punt bij Foucault weer diezelfde onttroning van het subject tegenkomen, waarover we in verband met Galilei in het begin reeds gesproken hebben. De filosofie van Foucault is een filosofie waarbij de filosoof zelf eigenlijk voortdurend uit het beeld verdwijnt. Ja, paradoxaal genoeg zou je moeten zeggen, dat is eigenlijk een filosofie zonder filosoof. En je moet dit ook nog generaliseren, want de mens is bij Foucault in zekere zin de grote afwezige in zijn eigen cultuur. En het is in dit verband dan ook heel begrijpelijk dat Foucault nogal fel en afwijzend reageert wanneer de gespreksleider belangstelling begint te vertonen voor privéaspecten van zijn bestaan. Wanneer Foucault debatteert, dan gaat het over alles, behalve over Foucault zelf. Dit dus ter introductie op dit volgende, vrij uitvoerige theoretische stuk van het debat, dat eigenlijk maar voortdurend allerlei aspecten van één hoofdvraag behandelt, en wel de vraag: in hoeverre is de mens in staat iets nieuws te ontdekken, en als dat zo is, hoe moeten we het dan begrijpen? Het lijkt mij een erg relevante vraag, zeker als we bedenken dat we nogal wat nieuwe vormen van gedrag, kennis en wetenschap nodig zullen hebben, willen we het er in onze wereld met elkaar levend afbrengen. We nemen nu de draad weer op waar Foucault toelicht waarom hij aan de creativiteit van het individu in de geschiedenis niet zoveel aandacht besteedt.
Dans l'histoire traditionnelle des sciences, on accorde en effet le maximum, enfin, la tradition veut qu'on accorde le maximum à la créativité des individus. L'histoire des sciences, jusqu'à ces dernières années, consistait essentiellement à montrer en quoi un individu, que ce soit Newton ou que ce soit Mendel, peu importe, avait été effectivement le créateur ou le découvreur plutôt d'une vérité qui était là, inscrite dans les choses et dans le monde, et que personne avant eux n'aurait vu. Le postulat qu'il y a, je crois, qui dort en quelque sorte sous l'histoire des sciences traditionnelles, c'est ceci, c'est que la vérité est là pour être connue et que pourtant l'esprit de l'homme, par la suite, par l'effet d'un certain nombre d'inhibitions ou d'obstacles, n'est pas parvenu à voir cette vérité. L'esprit de l'homme est fait pour voir la vérité et un obstacle contingent l'en empêche. Cet obstacle, ça peut être, eh bien, selon les historiens, les conditions économiques et sociales, ou ça peut être la forme des mentalités, ou ça peut être la crédulité, les vieux thèmes et mythes religieux, par exemple, ou moraux. Enfin, tout ceci constitue comme les
sounds like somebody's got some phone notifications coming in. If you could just mute that.
Est fait pour voir. En droit, l'esprit est fait pour avoir accès à la vérité. Dans cette conception traditionnelle de l'histoire des sciences, d'une part, si vous voulez, on donne toute la créativité à l'individu, qui est en droit possesseur de la vérité, et puis on la lui retire par le système des obstacles qui viennent d'une façon tout à fait contingente l'empêcher de saisir, de formuler, de construire cette vérité à laquelle il a droit en principe. Bon, alors moi, le problème qui s'est posé à moi, c'était précisément un peu l'inverse. Parce que qu'est-ce qui se passe quand on assiste à une grande transformation scientifique? Dans une transformation scientifique, comme par exemple la naissance de la biologie au milieu du XVIIe siècle, ou la naissance de la philologie à la fin du XVIIIe, au début du XIXe. C'est vrai qu'un certain nombre d'obstacles, un certain nombre de préjugés, un certain nombre d'idées toutes faites tombent et viennent à disparaître. Mais ce qui m'a frappé, c'est qu'une science, au moment où elle naît, non seulement se débarrasse d'un certain nombre d'obstacles et d'obscurités, mais en même temps, elle supprime un certain nombre de savoirs et de connaissances existantes qu'elle occulte, qu'elle cache, comme si elle appliquait une grille nouvelle qui, tout en permettant de faire apparaître des phénomènes jusque-là cachés, cache des connaissances déjà acquises. Donc, une science, le progrès d'une science, l'acquisition d'une science, ce n'est pas simplement l'oubli des vieux préjugés, ce ne sont pas simplement les obstacles qui tombent, c'est une véritable nouvelle grille qui cache un certain nombre de choses et du coup fait apparaître. Donc, quand je critique la notion de créativité, je veux dire par là que, en fait, la vérité ne s'acquiert pas comme une sorte de création continue et cumulée, mais comme un jeu de grilles qui s'appliquent les unes sur les autres, cachées.
I think in part we're slightly talking in cross purposes because of a different use of the term creativity. In fact, I should say that my use of the term creativity is a little bit idiosyncratic, and therefore the onus falls on me, not on you in this case. But when I speak of creativity, I'm not attributing to the concept the notion of value that is normal when we speak of creativity. That is, when you speak of scientific creativity, you're speaking properly of the achievements of a Newton. But in the context in which I've been speaking about creativity, it's a normal human event. I'm speaking of the kind of creativity that any child demonstrates when he is able to come to grips with a new situation, describe it properly, react to it properly, tell us something about it, think about it in a new fashion for him, and so on. These are, I think it's appropriate to call those creative acts, but of course without thinking of those acts as being the acts of a Newton. It's the lower levels of creativity that I've been speaking of. Now, as far as what you say about the history of science is concerned, I think that's correct and illuminating, and particularly relevant, in fact, to the kinds of enterprise that I see lying before us in psychology and linguistics and the philosophy of mind. That is, I think there are certain topics that have been, what was your word, depressed or put aside during the scientific advances of the, say, past 2 centuries, century and a half. But now I think we can overcome those, or it's possible to put aside those limitations and forgettings and to bring into our consideration precisely the topics that animated a good deal of the thinking and speculation of the 17th and 18th century, and to incorporate it within a much broader and I think deeper science of man that will give fuller role, though certainly not will not hope to give complete understanding to such notions as innovation and creativity and freedom and production of new new elements of thought and behavior within some system of rule and schematism. Those are concepts that I think we can come to grips with.
Je crois qu'entre ce qu'a dit M. Chomsky à l'instant et puis ce que j'essaie de montrer, il y a en réalité beaucoup de ressemblances. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a en fait de création possible, d'innovation possible. On ne peut, dans l'ordre du langage ou dans l'ordre du savoir, produire quelque chose de nouveau qu'en mettant en jeu un certain nombre de règles qui vont définir l'acceptabilité ou la grammaticalité des énoncés, ou qui va définir, dans le cas du savoir, la scientificité des énoncés. Alors, disons en gros que les linguistes, avant M. Chomsky, ont surtout insisté sur les règles de construction des énoncés et moins sur l'innovation que représente tout énoncé nouveau ou l'audition d'un énoncé nouveau. Et puis, dans l'histoire des sciences ou dans l'histoire de la pensée, on avait beaucoup plus l'habitude d'insister sur la création individuelle et on avait tenu à l'écart, on avait laissé dans l'ombre ces espèces de règles communes, générales, qui sont en œuvre obscurément à travers toute découverte scientifique, toute invention scientifique, ou même d'ailleurs toute innovation philosophique. Des règles non seulement linguistiques, mais épistémologiques, et qui caractérisent le savoir contemporain.
Well, I think perhaps I can try to react to those comments within my own framework in a way which maybe will shed some light on this. How is it that we're able to construct any kind of scientific theory at all? How is it that given a small amount of data, it's possible for various scientists, for various geniuses even over a long period of time, to arrive at some kind of a theory, at least in some cases, that is more or less profound and more or less empirically adequate? This is a remarkable fact. And in fact, if it were not the case that these scientists, including the geniuses, if they didn't have built into their minds somehow, obviously unconscious, specification of what is a possible scientific theory, then this inductive leap would certainly be quite impossible. Just as if each child did not have built into his mind the concept of human language in a very natural way, in a very narrowing way, then the inductive leap from data to knowledge of a language would be impossible. So even though the process of, let's say, deriving knowledge of physics from data is far more complex, far more difficult for us, for organisms such as us, far more drawn out in time, requires intervention of genius and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, in a certain sense, the achievement of discovering physical science or biology or whatever you like is based on something rather similar to the achievement of the normal child in discovering the structure of his language. That is, it must be achieved on the basis of an initial limitation, an initial restriction on the class of possible theories. And the fact that science converges and progresses, that itself shows us that such initial limitations and structures exist. That is, I don't think that scientific progress is simply a matter of accumulative addition of new knowledge and absorption of new theories and so on. Rather, I think it has this sort of jagged pattern that you described, forgetting certain problems and leaping to new theories and so on and so forth.
Et transformant les mêmes connaissances.
Right. But I think that the explanation for that, so I think one can perhaps hazard an explanation for that fact. And oversimplifying grossly, I really don't mean what I'm now going to say literally. It's as if, as human beings, a particular biologically given organism, we have in our heads, to start with, a certain set of possible intellectual structures, possible sciences, okay? Now, in the lucky event that some aspect of reality happens to have the character of one of these structures in our mind, then we have a science. So, and it's because of this limitation, initial limitation in our minds to a certain kind of possible science, it's precisely that that provides the tremendous richness and creativity of scientific knowledge. That is, if it were not, it's important to stress that. This has to do with your point about limitations. If it were not for these limitations, we would not have the creative act of going from a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of experience, to a rich and highly articulated and complicated array of knowledge. It's precisely because of that that the progress of science, I think, has the erratic and jagged and transformational character that you describe. And that doesn't mean that everything is ultimately going to fall within the domain of science. Quite the contrary. Personally, I believe that many of the things we would like to understand, and maybe the things we would most like to understand, such as the nature of man or the nature of a decent society or lots of other things, might really fall outside the scope of possible human sciences.
Well, I think we have now two questions out of this statement. One question is, if you can agree, Mr. Foucault, do you agree with the statement about a combination of limitation?
I have a question for you, Ben, actually, because, again, as I mentioned, Chomsky makes no bones about the fact that he situates himself in the broadly Enlightenment tradition, particularly the mature Enlightenment of figures like Humboldt, but he's variably described his linguistics and his conception of human nature as Cartesian and Kantian, Humboldtian. I think that certainly the way he's articulating it here, it seems extraordinarily Kantian in his connotations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Descartes here.
Yeah, exactly, right. But the notion that there are certain fundamental conditions for the human understanding of the phenomenal world that exist cognitively within us a priori, and that without those kind of conditions, we wouldn't be able to understand one another, let alone expand the world outside of us. But these limitations can never be firmly overcome. And in fact, a lot of the things that we'd like to say about reality in and of itself are precluded by the same limitations that make possible creative acts of rationalization when it comes to the world. Would you say that that seems right?
Like as a description for his view?
Yeah, like, well, this is kind of what I might call the Kantian interpretation of Chomsky's view.
I mean, like I said, that's certainly how he seems to be expressing it, like right now in this debate.
Yeah, because I've never quite understood why he characterizes his linguistics at times as Cartesian, except for the idea that there's kind of these built-in structures, right?
Yeah, it was his first book, I think, right? The Cartesian linguistics. But yeah, you were going to say, Russell?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I totally agree with that. You know, earlier I said I distinguish between Foucault as an epistemologist and Chomsky as an empiricist, but here clearly, I think that it is a Kantian frame because it does. I thought the same exact thing, that it's like a priori structures of mind, and so in that regard of his argument, it would, you know, I mean, in the Kantian sense of the term, it would be much more rationalist, right? So my suspicion, which is not based on having done any kind of deep dive into Chomsky linguistics, but like from what I know about it, my suspicion is that probably it really did start out like, okay, maybe he was using Cartesian to just sort of dramatically underline the point. It was always like this, but my suspicion is that it might have started out with like a little it might have started out more Cartesian and less Kantian than this, like as he sort of started to like think harder about and like narrow, make more precise his theory of what exactly these innate linguistic structures are, probably got a bit more Kantian. I'd say also on the empiricism issue. So, I mean, if you think like the sort of like intro to philosophy kind of definition of empiricism, that all right, the rationalist thinks that that some of our knowledge is well, some of our substantive knowledge is a priori, right? Everybody thinks that our knowledge, there are some trivial things that our knowledge of just comes from definitions and logic, but that all of our substantive knowledge, is empirical. It only comes from external evidence. Then yeah, I mean, he's certainly not that, and I think never was. But I guess a couple things I'd say about that are that I think actually, like, the more you read about like the British empiricists, like the less clear it is that any of them really fit that definition. Yeah. Like I certainly don't think Hume was an empiricist in that sense. No. Yeah, right.
Even Locke's account of the self is really dependent upon memory, right? So it's kind of hard to make the argument that he'd be a strict empirical realist in the sense of Stephen Hicks today, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, in fact, with Hume, certainly, like, his. I mean, people oftentimes, like, in this weird way, right? They talk about him like he's a skeptic, about knowledge, and of course, he's nothing of the kind. If you read the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he says, after pointing out all these problems with like explaining how we can, have evidence-based knowledge of various things, that only a fool or a madman, would deny that we actually do, that those things are true, which certainly suggests to me that he has some sort of underlying view that, that there's that there is some, that there is some sort of externalist sense, in which we become aware of these things that, sure, we can't replicate the reasoning, but that doesn't actually mean that, we don't know perfectly well that, an external world exists and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of, I think it's in the Inquiry where he's talking about, the philosopher Stanley Cavell talks about this a lot. I think it's in the Claim of Reason, or maybe it must we mean what we say. But at one point Hume is talking about where he's basically laid out the position of skepticism, the skeptical position, and then he says, but then it actually makes him melancholy, and then I go out and I shoot pool with my friends, and you can't live your skepticism. And so that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, where like theory and application, the theory sort of falls apart because we betray, even if you're a skeptic, you betray it with your actions all the time by going out and acting that as if there are other people and there's an external world and it exists. And that as if is actually crucial because when you act that way, it brings this into play. But Ben, I think your point about that Hume isn't a skeptic is really interesting, because it would go right, like Locke empiricist, Hume skeptic, Berkeley idealist. And I think that line between like skepticism and idealism, I'm like Berkeley and idealism is a form of skepticism that you don't get in Hume. And so I think that was a really crucial clarification there. But then I was also thinking about, with regard to bring it back to the debate, it's interesting that Chomsky here articulates a sort of Kantian notion of I don't know, philosophy of mind in a way, because of course, like one of Foucault's most anthologized pieces is what Enlightenment, responding to Kant, and that's something that, right, Foucault is very much trying to, in the sort of post-structuralist vein, to sort of unravel or deconstruct it in a way. And so that's, I think, like, in order to see the differences between the two, because in that last sort of clip we watched, or the last sort of 10 minutes or so, there was a lot of agreement. And so to see the disagreement between them, you kind of have to approach it sort of like obliquely, but it's there, right?
Well, I actually had a more general question. Maybe Russell, you'd want to chime in on this, and then Ben here, because I think Russell probably has some pretty developed thoughts on it. But you hear like Foucault articulate this fundamentally kind of Kuhnian approach to science,
Right.
right? Which is that we shouldn't see it in this teleological fashion as the progression of empirical knowledge, which is then theoretized by genius. There are ruptures, there are breaks, and we're always kind of wearing glasses that are historically and socially determined that frame our understanding of the empirical world. You can call them paradigms or discourse or whatever it is that you want.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of interested in why it is that a lot of people on the political left are attracted to these understandings of the history of scientific thought. Because, and I mean, certainly there are some people on the political left who are quite hostile to them, so I don't want to generalize too broadly, right? But, a lot of people in grad school that I went to consider themselves radicals. This is the kind of stock approach to the history of science that they took. So do you have any thoughts on why it is that this seems to have kind of almost visceral appeal?
Boy, it's a good question. I think frankly that especially within academic philosophy, I mean, there is philosophy that's not academic, but I just think basically, I mean, outside of philosophy, like in the academy, I think that we are a good friend of mine, Anna Kornblue, is actually working on a book about this, but we are far more adept at critique than something constructive. And I think that I'm sort of staunchly against these the sort of nascent, or I guess not really nascent, it's with us now. I mean, especially in literary studies and maybe a little bit in political theory, but this notion of sort of post critique and post criticism. Yeah. And I'm firmly against that. I think we need to remain committed to the critique of ideology, but there is a sense in which the notion of the political and what's possible has been so attenuated and so it's so strained, or just like we don't have the resources to think about it now, that it's sort of I think it's comforting to actually like think that the critique itself is enough, as opposed to articulating a broader vision. And I think that's where like Chomsky, I think, is stronger than Foucault, because Foucault's is really a politics. I think it kind of speaks, I mean, maybe this addresses your question, Nat, but I think that very much so, like liberal left everything is still very much a politics of resistance. And that, I think, is what, without trivializing Foucault's contribution, I think that Foucaultianism is primarily a philosophy or a project of resistance, as opposed to, which is why like a lot of political theory that comes out of Foucault is, power is something that is inherently tainted and inherently bad. And so there's no sort of redeeming of power. And so if power is something that is to be avoided, then all you can do is have these sort of gestures of critique where you keep looking at these different levels of society in which power is, there's power invested in it, but even it might not be manifestly, right?
Yeah, this, by the way, like is one of the things I think that it's go back to one of the first things you said at the beginning, is I think one of the worst, influences of Foucault on certainly academic leftists, because it's one of these things. It's like if everybody's guilty, nobody's guilty. Like if everything is some kind of power relation, then like you're really obscuring like the sort of fundamental institutional things that the left as a left would naturally focus on. It's like Noah Berlatsky saying that like parents are an oppressor class. Like white people or rich people. It's kind of that. I mean, obviously, like not all of it's like silly on that level, but this, thinking like seeing any kind of like anything that has any kind of like power differential anywhere in the neighborhood of it as being basically the same thing as the kind of structures of legal inequality or economic exploitation that that the socialists would traditionally be concerned with. I think is a huge problem politically, for a lot of the contemporary academic left, and that however genuinely insightful he was about lots of things, Foucault definitely does have some of the responsibility for that.
Well, I just want to chime in there by saying I 100% think that his criticism of the kind of teleological understanding of science that people sometimes put forward in the early Enlightenment was very well founded.
Yeah.
I also really kind of appreciate the fact that he pointed out that oftentimes appeals to science, or scientism at the least, have been used to justify all kinds of atrocities and all kinds of very malignant forms of power. I mean, I'm reading a book about Nazi Germany right now, and the examples in that are just replete when it came to things like eugenics and so on and so forth. On the other hand, right, I do think that he bears some culpability for the kind of cheesy hyper-relativism that you sometimes see on the political left right now. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but just as a kind of rhetorical point, I mean, when people, and Ben made this point actually in his first book, Give Them an Argument, right? When people see left-wing theorists saying things like, no, A does not equal A, or 2 + 2 does not have to equal 4 because that's just a kind of imposition, I don't think it's a particularly good look for us to wear.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think, and actually, I do want to try to directly answer the question you asked earlier about why these kinds of relativist or quasi-relativist views about science, seem to have a visceral appeal for some contemporary leftists. Contemporary, by the way, is a key word there because
I should say Foucault's account is a lot more sophisticated. I'd even say than Kuhn's account in Structure of Scientific Religion.
Yeah, as much as
so I'm not trying to say that he's to blame for all of his self-appointed disciples.
As much as in this debate, I mean, yeah, it's the same way Chomsky's version of his rationalist linguistics sounds like Kantian, metaphysics here. The Foucault's explanation of his views in science here sounds super Kuhnian, but yeah, look. So again, contemporary is an important qualification because who wasn't remotely attracted to any sort of epistemic, relativism about science? Karl Marx. If anything, what little Marx and Engels say about this is kind of naive realist. That material. That we know exactly. That obviously can sometimes be hard to find out, but that there is clearly something called material reality, and there's a fact of the matter of it, and it's waiting for us to find out. But then I think when it comes to contemporary leftists who oftentimes are attracted to these sort of quasi-relativist views about science, I have at least two possible answers, one of which is a little mean and one of which is more charitable. So the first one is just that that leftists, so many of whom are academics, because there's a deep sense in which, like Adolf Reed, talks about, that we sort of don't have a left right now in the United States. That if by left you mean the sort of thing that's existed in other societies, in the 20th century, that has this kind of social weight within the working class and can act politically in certain ways and all that. We don't really have that. We have left media, we have left intellectuals. We have some kind of activist organizations, but none of it quite adds up to the same thing. And so many leftists, aren't those Gramscian organic intellectuals. They come out of academia. Which whatever. All three of us do. Cards on the table, and frankly, I think academic leftists are way more likely to come out. Be film studies majors than physics majors. And so I think that some of it's just kind of, I don't know, some of this stuff really is as simple as just being kind of intellectual penis envy or something. That's we have it, it's like, oh, you don't want to, you want to take the hard sciences down a notch. That's the uncharitable interpretation. The more charitable interpretation, and somebody in the chat, I think, put their finger on this really nicely, has to do with one of the big themes of our departed friend Michael Brooks's excellent book Against the Web, which is that when it comes to historical analysis, of political structures, economics, relations between the genders, all that stuff, right? That one of the big fundamental distinctions between leftism and reactionary thought is that reactionaries tend to either naturalize or mythologize. In other words, to either attribute things to to just biology, like look, I mean, even lobsters have hierarchy, that sort of bullshit, and or mythologize, that'll be naturalizing, or the mythologizing version would be talking about, stick with the same reactionary, right? Talking about the dragon of chaos or whatever, right? That we need to have the traditional social order to keep that at bay. Whereas
I was gonna say Peterson does both. That's the nice thing about
it. Yeah,
right?
Peterson has a rare facility for sliding back and forth between the two versions of reactionary analysis. Whereas the left, when it's talking about subjects like that, naturally and appropriately historicizes, right? We say no. These things are historically contingent. That society happens to be organized this way, but there's no reason it couldn't be. But that arose under certain specific conditions, and it could go out of existence under other conditions. It's it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, like, really, as simple as it is, what I just said kind of is the core of what it is to be a leftist, is to think that about social structures. And so I think that given that, it could be the case that some leftists, with the best intentions of the world, might sort of over-apply that insight, right? And so say, okay, well, we tend to, when we're thinking about politics, we tend to historicize rather than naturalizing. So then they just sort of go nuts applying that same instinct everywhere else, when it might not make equal amounts of sense in every domain.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Michael's book, because when I first read it, part of me was like, there is a Foucauldian strain in there of historicization, because I mean, in the field of literary studies, like, historicism came out of Foucault, and I think that the work that Foucault's version of form of historicization is extremely important. But when it goes too far, and I think I might be this debate, but you'll notice that whenever you try to translate that into politics, it translates into a skepticism of, or a reticence to have a sort of political program, again, other than kind of resisting power. Because I think what happens is that at some point, like, Foucault's historicism is much more applicable to for like an ethics than a politics. And I think that he becomes skeptical, like, well, because we don't know, there is no fundamental human nature. We don't know what the next episteme is going to be, that we are sort of inhibiting future man or whatever, or there are types of discursive forms of power that we haven't taken into account yet. And so power is always the enemy. And so I think that really hamstrings you in a way. You can't come up with a positive concrete political vision, which of course is the opposite of what you get in, I think it's the last chapter of Michael's book. And so, yeah, I think, like, Ben, you were basically saying the same thing that I just said, but I wanted to sort of follow up on and elaborate on it a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think that ties into what I was trying to express earlier about everything is power, because if everything is power, and you go into this like microscopic detail of like human interactions and power differentials in them, then okay, no possible human society would get rid of all of that. Like that we're just stuck with it. So in a way, like, you end up becoming a conservative. I mean, look, this is one of the major tenets of the conservative intellectual tradition. It's the futility thesis. So no matter how radical your original intentions, I think the effect of that can be kind of conservative. I think that the way that Michael threads the needle in that last chapter of Against the Web is exactly right. And I know from many conversations with him, is the part of the book that was the most important to him, that sort of saying, look, I don't want to I don't want to dismiss concern with cultural issues as some sort of, you know, like just like a silly distraction or something. Obviously, this is where people spend their lives. You know, this is important that we have something to say about it. But, you know, you also like don't want to, you know, you don't want to go with a version of leftism that, you know, where you end up seeming like you're just this like insufferable, you know, hall monitor of like every petty interaction. You know, it's like, oh, you know, if like, well, oh, you know, you can't make that dish, you know, that's cultural appropriation, you know, like that. So I think that the way I don't want to get us too far off track. Obviously, we've got a long way to go in the debate, and we need to get back to it. But I think that there's a vision there that's really valuable about how we can tie together economic leftism with a vision of the world and how people can live together in it that, like, you know, human beings would actually find appealing.
Well, you can denaturalize and demythologize and still have a positive political vision. That's what I think is that we need to. That's something that we need to, you know, that's a point we need to make more forcefully.
For sure.
I also wanted to give Foucault props because while the language of reason and enlightenment originally was a highly emancipatory one, what he explores, I think, with great genius in a lot of his works is precisely how it was that this language could become calcified and used to justify various reactionary positions, right? And imagine were Foucault alive today, he would have just lacerating things to say about the IDW, precisely how it is that they use the language and rhetoric of reason, strip it from its kind of radical enlightenment core in order to justify, naturalize, or mythologize, to use Ben's language, various far-right positions. And you see these speakers do that all the time, whether you're talking about Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, or Dave Rubin, right? Kind of turning the weapons of the radical enlightenment against it.